The year was 1886, and the location was a desolate stretch of high prairie in the Montana Territory, a place where the wind carried a bite long before the snow ever touched the ground. To the casual observer, the landscape was nothing but potential, acres of gold grass waiting for cattle or the plow. But to Mary, a woman who had buried more memories than she cared to count, the land was a mathematical equation of survival that most people were solving incorrectly. She did not start her cabin by felling trees or measuring logs, which was the standard practice for the homesteaders rushing to beat the October frosts. Instead, Mary began with a shovel and a pickaxe, breaking the hard-packed earth in a rectangle that measured precisely 20 feet by 16 feet. She dug with a ferocity that unsettled those who rode past, driving the trench down past the frost line, a full 4 feet deep, until her spade hit the bedrock that underpinned the valley. It was back-breaking, calorie-consuming labor that seemed entirely unnecessary for a simple shelter. Yet she continued, day after day, piling dirt into precise mounds and squaring the corners with lengths of twine and wooden stakes. When the local cattle drovers passed by, they would slow their horses, tilting their hats back to stare at the lone woman waist deep in the earth, sweating through her linen shirt as she tossed spadeful after spadeful of clay over the rim. To them, it looked like she was digging a mass grave or the basement for a bank, not a home for a single woman. One of the neighbors, a man named Thomas, who prided himself on the speed with which he had slapped together his own shanty, rode up to the edge of the excavation one afternoon, his shadow stretching long over Mary's work. He watched her for a long moment, chewing on a stem of grass before laughing a short, sharp sound that was swallowed by the wind. "You planning on burying the house, Mary?" Thomas asked, leaning over his saddle horn with a grin that suggested he thought she had lost her mind. "Frost is coming in 6 weeks. You'll be sleeping in a hole while the rest of us are warm by the fire." Mary did not stop digging. She merely paused to wipe the grit from her forehead with the back of a gloved hand, looking up at him with eyes that held no humor, only a terrifying focus. "A house without feet is just a pile of wood waiting to fall," she said, her voice flat and raspy from the dust. "You build for the season you see, Thomas. I'm building for the one I know is coming." He laughed again, shaking his head as he turned his horse back toward the trail. "Suit yourself, Mary, but don't come knocking when the snow fills that pit up." She watched him ride away, then drove the pickaxe back into the clay, the metal ringing out like a bell against a hidden stone. The digging was only the preamble to the true madness, or so the community whispered as the weeks of late summer began to bleed into early autumn. Once the trench was finished, Mary did not begin dragging logs. She began dragging stone. She utilized a crude stone boat, a flat wooden sled without wheels, harnessed to a single, aging draft horse she called Buster. Together, they made endless trips to the dry riverbed 2 miles south, selecting specific stones with an obsessiveness that bordered on ritual. She wasn't looking for just any rock. She chose granite and basalt, heavy, dense stones that had been tumbled smooth by centuries of water, rejecting anything with a fracture or a seam that might split under pressure. The sheer tonnage she moved was staggering, a physical feat that defied her slender frame. She would pry a 100-pound boulder from the mud, leverage it onto the sled using a complex system of fulcrums and iron bars, and then walk alongside the horse as they dragged the load back uphill. The tracks of the sled became deep ruts in the prairie grass, a testament to the weight she was transporting. By the time September arrived, the perimeter of her site was lined with mounds of gray and black stone, looking like the ruins of some ancient fortification rather than the beginning of a home. Hiram, an older rancher who had survived 20 winters in the territory and possessed a quieter, more observant skepticism than Thomas, stopped his wagon one morning to watch her mix mortar. She was using a specific recipe she had learned from a stonemason back east. 1 part lime, 3 parts sharp river sand, and a splash of water, mixed to the consistency of stiff dough. Hiram watched as she laid the first course of stones into the trench, keying them into the earth with a precision that seemed like a waste of time for a frontier cabin. "That's a lot of rock for a wooden box, Mary," Hiram noted, his voice rough but not unkind. He watched her check the level of a cornerstone, tapping it gently with the handle of her trowel until the bubble centered perfectly. "You're building a foundation strong enough to hold up a church. Seems like overkill for one woman and a stove." Mary didn't look up from her work, her hands moving with a practiced rhythm, scraping the excess mortar and feeding it back into the bucket. "The wind doesn't care if it's a church or a shack, Hiram," she replied, picking up another heavy stone and turning it in her hands until she found the face that would lock perfectly with its neighbor. "And the cold doesn't ask for permission to come inside. It just looks for the weak spot." Hiram watched her for a while longer, noting the sweat on her neck and the raw, red state of her knuckles. He wanted to tell her she was wasting her strength, that she should be cutting firewood or smoking meat, but there was a solidity to her work that silenced him. He tipped his hat and drove on, leaving her to the rhythmic scrape of the trowel against stone, a sound that echoed the ticking clock of the approaching winter. As the days grew shorter and the light took on the golden, slanted quality of October, the madness of Mary's plan became fully visible. She didn't just fill the trench. She brought the stone wall up, layer by agonizing layer, until it stood a full 4 feet above the ground level. It was a massive, continuous plinth of granite, 18 inches thick, enclosing the footprint of her future home. To the neighbors, it looked like a stone corral or an incomplete fortress. Thomas, passing by on his way to town to buy supplies he should have secured months ago, couldn't resist another jab. "You building a castle now, Mary?" he shouted over the rising wind, gesturing to the gray walls that now stood chest high. "You realize you can't live in a rock box, right? It'll draw the cold right out of you." He laughed, his breath puffing white in the chilling air. "My cabin's been up for weeks. Roof is tight. Maybe you should have focused on walls instead of a basement." Mary ignored the taunt, her focus entirely on the ventilation ports she was carefully constructing near the top of the stonework. This was the detail that confused the few observers who bothered to look closely. She wasn't sealing the foundation tight. She was installing small, iron-grated vents on the southern and northern faces, spaced with mathematical regularity. To Thomas, it looked like a mistake, a hole where the wind would whistle through. To Mary, it was a critical component of a system she carried in her head, a design born of physics and hard lessons learned in colder places. She smoothed the mortar around the iron grate, ensuring the seal was airtight everywhere except the vent itself. "Laugh all you want, Thomas," she murmured to herself once he was out of earshot, the wind snatching her words away. "But when the wolf comes to the door, straw and sticks won't hold him back." She was exhausted. Her hands were permanently curled into the shape of gripping tools, and her back screamed in protest every time she straightened up. But she didn't stop. She checked the barometer she kept wrapped in oilcloth near her supplies, a delicate instrument that was her only true companion. The needle was steady for now, but she knew the drop was coming. She wasn't just building a foundation. She was building a thermal battery, though she didn't use those words. She was building a massive heat sink that would absorb the sun by day and hold the earth's temperature by night, a concept so foreign to the timber-focused minds of the territory that it looked like lunacy. She laid the final stone on the northeast corner, the highest point of the foundation, and ran her hand along the rough, cold granite. It felt solid. It felt like insurance. With the stone foundation finally cured, the timber construction began. But even this Mary did differently. Most cabins in the area were built with the logs resting directly on the earth or on small cornerstones, a method that invited rot and allowed the freezing ground to suck the heat directly out of the floorboards. Mary, however, laid her heavy sill logs on top of the 4-foot stone wall, separating the wood from the soil by a massive thermal break. She worked alone, using a system of ropes, pulleys, and inclined planes to roll the heavy pine logs up the side of her stone plinth. It was slow, dangerous work. One slip could crush a limb or shatter the stone she had labored over, so she moved with the deliberate slowness of a bomb diffuser. She notched the corners with a sharp adze, creating dovetail joints that locked together so tightly a knife blade couldn't pass between them. The cabin rose quickly now, perched high atop its stone pedestal, looking strange and elevated compared to the squat, ground-hugging shacks of her neighbors. It looked like a house on stilts, or a lookout tower. The floor was laid not at the bottom of the stone pit, but on joists running across the top of the foundation, creating a massive enclosed crawl space beneath the living area. This was the madness Thomas had laughed at, a giant empty room of dirt and rock beneath her feet. Why waste all that labor for a hole? But as Mary packed the space between the floor joists with dry sawdust and straw for insulation, she wasn't thinking about wasted space. She was thinking about the cushion of dead air she was trapping, a buffer zone that would separate her feet from the frozen core of the earth. She caulked the gaps between the logs with a mixture of clay and horsehair, driving it into the cracks with a wooden mallet until the walls were seamless. By late November the roof was on, steep pitched to shed the snow, covered in cedar shakes she had split herself by lantern light. The structure was complete. It stood stark and imposing against the gray sky, a wooden box sitting on a stone fortress. It looked unconquerable, but it also looked alien. The other settlers, huddled in their low cabins with dirt floors that were already turning into freezing mud, shook their heads at Mary's tower. They didn't understand the physics of it. They didn't understand that she had lifted her home out of the moisture and the frost, creating a dry island in a sea of coming ice. The first test came not with snow, but with silence. It was the first week of December when the birds stopped singing. The sky turned a bruised purple in the north, a color that felt heavy, as if the air itself was condensing into a solid weight. The cattle on the distant ridges stopped grazing and began to drift instinctively toward the coulees, their breath steaming in the rapidly dropping temperature. Mary stood on her porch, 4 feet above the frozen ground, and watched the horizon. She could feel the pressure change in her ears, a subtle pop that signaled a massive front colliding with the plains. This was the moment she had been digging for. This was the equation finally balancing itself. She went inside and closed the heavy oak door, dropping the crossbar into place. The interior of the cabin was different from the others. It didn't smell of damp earth or mildew. It smelled of pine and dry stone. She lit the cast iron stove in the center of the room, the wood crackling sharply as the draft caught. But she didn't just sit by the fire. She moved to the trap door she had built into the floorboards, the secret access to the stone dungeon beneath her. She lifted it, revealing the dark, enclosed space of the foundation. It wasn't empty anymore. Over the last few weeks, she had filled the perimeter of the crawl space with root vegetables, preserved meats, and stacked cordwood, utilizing the natural refrigeration that wouldn't freeze solid thanks to the earth's warmth radiating up from the deep trench. But more importantly, she checked the vents. The wind outside was picking up, a low moan that was quickly turning into a scream. She could hear the siding of the cabin groan under the assault. It was time. Mary climbed back up, lowered the trap door, and rolled a heavy rag rug over it. She checked the thermometer on the wall. Outside, the temperature had plummeted 20 degrees in an hour. Inside, the heat from the stove was being absorbed by the thermal mass of the stone foundation below, the granite acting as a massive radiator that would hold the warmth long after the fire died down. The mockery of her neighbors, Thomas's laugh, the strange looks, felt like a distant memory now. The reality was pressing against the glass of her single window. The snow began to fall, not in flakes, but in horizontal sheets, driven by a wind that sought to scour the life from the prairie. The great blizzard was here, and the stone foundation was about to face the violence it was built for. The storm that descended on the Montana Territory in early 1886 was not merely a weather event. It was an atmospheric siege that would come to be known in history books as the Big Die-Up. For 3 days and nights the wind screamed with a velocity that stripped the bark from willows and drove snow through keyholes and chinking that had been considered airtight. Inside Mary's cabin, the world had shrunk to the glow of the cast-iron stove and the smell of drying wool, but the terror that gripped the rest of the valley was noticeably absent here. In a standard frontier shanty, like the one Thomas had built, the floor was the enemy. Laid directly over the freezing earth, the floorboards of a typical cabin would drop to temperatures indistinguishable from the snow outside, sucking the heat out of the room and leaving the occupants with frozen feet even as their faces burned from the stove. But Mary was walking on a surface that remained a steady, ambient temperature. The 4-foot stone foundation, sealed and insulated, had captured the earth's thermal mass. The air beneath her floorboards was not the 40 below zero gale raging outside. It was a calm, still pocket of air hovering around 45 degrees, warmed by the deep ground and protected by 18 inches of granite. The physics of her preparation were now paying dividends in calories and firewood. Because her floor wasn't stealing her heat, Mary burned half the wood her neighbors were frantically consuming. She sat in her rocking chair, sewing a tear in her canvas coat, listening to the wind batter the stone plinth below. The house didn't shudder. The heavy sill logs, bolted to the rock, held firm. She wasn't fighting the storm. She was outwaiting it, encased in a geological fortress that turned the blizzard's fury into harmless noise. She checked the thermometer again. 60 degrees inside. Stable. Outside, the world was dying. On the morning of the 4th day, the wind relented slightly, though the cold remained absolute, a crystalline lethargy that froze the moisture in a person's nose the instant they stepped outside. Mary was in the middle of kneading dough, utilizing the warmth of the kitchen that held so well thanks to her overkill construction, when she heard a sound that didn't belong to the wind. It was a dull, rhythmic thumping against the heavy oak of her front door, followed by a scratchy, desperate shout. She wiped the flour from her hands and moved to the door, lifting the heavy crossbar with a frown. When she pulled the door open, a cloud of steam billowed out, meeting the Arctic air in a violent swirl. There, slumped against the doorframe, was Thomas. He looked less like a man and more like a pillar of ice. His beard was a solid mask of white frost, his eyes were red-rimmed and wild, and he was shivering with a violence that rattled his teeth audibly. He had wrapped his feet in burlap sacks over his boots, but the clumsy frozen shapes suggested frostbite was already setting in. "Fire went out," he managed to choke out, the words slurring. "Wood's gone. Floor. Ice." He didn't wait for an invitation. Survival instinct drove him forward, stumbling past her into the wave of heat that rolled out of the cabin. Mary didn't waste time with "I told you so." She slammed the door against the cold and locked it, then grabbed a wool blanket from the peg, draping it over his trembling shoulders. He collapsed onto the floor, not a chair, but the floor itself. And then he stopped. He pressed his gloved hands against the pine planks, his eyes widening in confusion. He expected the biting sting of freezing wood, the same cold that had driven him from his own shanty. Instead, he felt warmth. The heat from the crawl space, the wasteful pit he had laughed at, was radiating up through the joists, keeping the floor warm to the touch. "It's hot," he whispered, peeling off a stiff glove to touch the wood with his bare hand. "How is the floor hot, Mary?" Mary moved with the efficiency of a field medic, pouring a cup of hot water from the kettle kept constantly on the stove and pressing it into Thomas's shaking hands. "It's not magic, Thomas. It's mass," she said, her voice calm and devoid of mockery, though the lesson was sharp enough to cut. The ground down deep is 45 degrees. You built on the frost. I built on the earth. She walked to the center of the room and kicked the rug aside, revealing the trap door. Thomas watched, mesmerized and slightly delirious, as she lifted the hatch. A waft of earthy, cool but not freezing air drifted up, smelling of potatoes and cured meat. He peered over the edge. Down in the stone foundation, in the dungeon he had ridiculed, sat crates of vegetables, unfrozen and firm. There were stacks of dry firewood, safe from the snowdrifts that had buried everyone else's wood piles. It was a cellar, a pantry, and a heater all in one. The stone eats the cold, Mary explained, descending halfway down the ladder to grab a few potatoes and a log. And it holds the heat from the stove. My fire heats the stones heat the air heats the floor. You were trying to heat the whole Montana winter with a tin box. I just heat the cabin. Thomas looked around the room, really seeing it for the first time. He saw the lack of drafts, the dry corners where no frost had formed, the steady comfort that felt like a different planet compared to the icy tomb his own cabin had become. The arrogance that had fueled his laughter in September had been frozen out of him, replaced by a terrified awe. He realized that while he had been playing at being a pioneer, Mary had been engineering a survival machine. "I thought you were digging a grave," he murmured, sipping the hot water, the color slowly returning to his nose. "I was," Mary replied, dropping the trap door shut with a solid thud. "Just not for me." The storm broke 2 days later, revealing a landscape that had been scrubbed clean of life. The drifts were 10 feet high in places, sculpted into razor-sharp ridges by the wind. When Hiram finally made it up the ridge on his snowshoes to check on the scattered community, the scene was grim. He found Thomas's cabin half buried, the door blown open, the interior filled with a snowdrift that had extinguished the stove days ago. He feared the worst until he saw the trail of footsteps, filled in but still visible as depressions, leading toward Mary's place. When Hiram approached Mary's cabin, he stopped in his tracks. The structure looked defiant. The wind had scoured the snow away from the high stone foundation, leaving the granite walls exposed and bare, black against the blinding white. The heat radiating from the stones had actually melted a small perimeter of snow around the base, creating a clear zone where the grass was visible, brown and dry. It was a thermal miracle. Hiram knocked, and Mary answered, looking tired but unharmed. Behind her, Thomas was sitting by the stove, peeling potatoes, looking humble and very much alive. Hiram stepped inside, stamping the snow from his boots, and immediately felt the difference. It wasn't just warm, it was dry. The humidity that plagued every other house, the condensation dripping from the ceiling, the damp bedding, was gone. The stone mass modulated the moisture as well as the heat. "Thomas told me about the floor," Hiram said, taking off his hat and looking down at his feet. "He says it's like standing on a warm rock in the sun." Mary nodded, pouring coffee. "Physics doesn't change just because you're in a hurry, Hiram," she said. "The frost line is a law. You either obey it or you pay the fine." Hiram walked over to the window, looking out at the devastation where the cattle herds had been decimated, frozen where they stood. He looked back at the solid, stone-anchored walls of Mary's home. He wasn't laughing. He was taking mental notes. He asked to see the vents, asked about the mortar mix, asked about the depth of the trench. The practical skeptic had become the student. In the years that followed, the Mary Foundation became a local legend, though few called it that to her face. The spring thaw of 1887 revealed the full extent of the tragedy. Hollowed-out herds and abandoned shanties. But it also revealed the validity of Mary's method. New settlers who arrived in the valley were no longer advised to throw up a quick shack to beat the frost. Instead, Hiram and Thomas, who became the unlikely evangelists of Mary's engineering, would take them to the high ridge. They would point to the cabin that sat on its 4-foot throne of granite, the only structure that hadn't shifted, leaked, or frozen during the big die-up. "You see that stone?" Thomas would say, his voice lacking its old arrogance. "You dig until you hit bedrock, then you dig another foot. You build it heavy, or you don't build it at all." The laughter was gone, replaced by a quiet, reverent imitation. Other cabins began to rise on stone plinths. The valley started to look different, dotted with heavy granite foundations that anchored the wooden structures against the sky. Mary continued to live there for 40 years, a solitary figure who had turned a shovel and a pickaxe into a legacy. She never expanded the cabin, never sought to be a leader, but her survival was the only proof the territory needed. She had understood a fundamental truth that the West tries hard to teach, but few learn in time. Nature is not an enemy to be fought with bravery. It is a force to be managed with calculation. The overkill that had drawn the neighbor's ridicule was simply the price of admission for a life that lasted. As you look at your own preparations, ask yourself, are you building for the best case scenario, or are you digging deep enough for the storm you know is coming? If you want to join a community that values this kind of deep, forgotten wisdom, make sure to subscribe and share this story. We are preserving the blueprints of survival, one stone at a time. Mary's cabin is gone now, reclaimed by the earth eventually. But if you go to that ridge in Montana, you can still find the foundation, a perfect rectangle of moss-covered granite, still level, still square, and still standing strong against the wind.